Welcome to a KeySmash Studios tutorial. In this video, we're going to be starting on our inventory system. This is part 2 of our collection game series, and we'll cover initializing the inventory, iterating through the inventory, and adding items to our inventory. If you didn't watch the previous part, I'll provide the link for that in the description below. In that video, I covered how to create an item class so that way you can have different types of items with different amounts collected. As you're watching, if you find this video helpful, please remember to like and subscribe. To go ahead and begin, we're going to create a new C++ class. It's going to be an actor component, and we're going to name it My Inventory. And the reason we're using an actor component is because it makes the script reusable on any actor, so that way we can have an inventory for, say, a crate, and an inventory for the player without having to recreate the code for the two separate things. And now that the script's created, be sure that you're in your header, and we're going to go ahead and create our functions. The first function is going to be for initializing our inventory, and it's going to be void. We're going to call it initialize inventory. And what we'll end up doing inside that function is just filling our inventory with empty values. Our next function is going to be for iterating through our inventory, so we're just going to call it iterate, but this one is going to have a parameter, and we'll just call it float value. Our final function will be for adding items to our inventory. This one will also be void, and we'll just call it add item. And this one's going to have two parameters. Our first one is going to be an f string, and it will be the name of the item. And our next parameter is going to be an integer, and this will be the amount. From here, we can go ahead and create our properties. We're going to have a few of them, so I'm just going to explain them as I go. The first one is going to be for our inventory size, so it's going to be int inventory size. And the reason I have this as a property instead of just a static number inside the functions is so that way you can change it depending on the inventory. So going back to the crate versus player inventories, if you wanted your crate to have 50 inventory slots but your player to only have 5, you'd be able to do this through the inventory size property. Our next property is also going to be an integer. This one is going to be called selected I, and this will be used to keep track of the current index that we're at in our inventory. And then finally, the last two properties are going to both be arrays. The first one is going to be a t-array of f strings, and we're going to call this item names. And the next one is going to be a t-array of integers, and this one is going to be item amounts. And this is going to work by having an item that has the same index for its name as it does for its amount, so that way we can get the correct corresponding amount for each item. And that's all we're going to be doing inside the header, so we can go ahead and open up our CPP. And the first thing we're going to be doing in here is going to our constructor and giving some defaults to our properties. So the first thing we want to default is our inventory size. I'm going to do 3 for the simplicity of the tutorial. However, this number can be as large or as small as you want. And then for my selected I, I'm going to start that at 0, as I want my player to start at the beginning index of the inventory. From here, I'm going to go down to begin play, and I'm going to go ahead and call the initialize inventory function. And the reason I'm calling this in begin play is so that at the start of the game, the inventory is filled with empty values. We can go ahead and create this function. So it's going to be void u my inventory, and this is initialize inventory. And this had no parameters. And inside this, all we're going to be doing is adding empty inventory slots to our arrays until we've reached that inventory size cap. So we'll go ahead and create the for loop for adding these items. And we want to make sure that this continues while our I is less than inventory size. And again, all we're doing inside this is adding an empty value to both the name and the amount. So we're going to be doing item names dot add, and we're going to add the string of empty. And then we're going to do the same thing for our amounts, but it's an integer, so we're going to do add the value of 0. And again, this is going to take our arrays and add new slots until we reach the inventory size with these empty values. If you're not wanting your player to start with a fully empty inventory, you would add those items here as well, but you would do it outside the for loop and then change the I equals 0 to however far into the inventory you want to start adding empties. So for instance, if you wanted your player to start with a sword, you would take the 2 lines inside the for loop, put them above the for loop, change the string of empty to sword and the amount of 0 to 1, and then for your for loop you would do int I equals 1. So that way you skip that first index where you've already added the sword. But I want my player to start with everything empty, so we're going to leave it here and go ahead and create our iterate function. So again, this one was a void uMyInventory, and then this was iterate, and we had a float value as a parameter. We're going to end up using the mouse wheel to iterate through our inventory, and so when the player moves the mouse wheel forward, we want to iterate in the positive direction through our inventory, and when the player moves the mouse wheel backwards, we want to iterate in the negative direction. And we're going to determine this through the parameter of float value, so we want to take our selected I and plus equals the value to it. And this value is eventually going to be tied to the mouse wheel, so that way whenever it goes forward, it will add a positive 1, and whenever it goes backwards, it'll add a negative 1. Now that we've done that, we need handling for when the player reaches the caps of our inventory. So we'll go ahead and do if selected I is less than 0, in other words, the player has gone into the negatives, then we want to circle them around the inventory to the last item. So the way we're going to do that is by doing selected I is equal to inventory size minus 1. And for those who don't understand why I'm doing a minus 1, this is because the inventory size in this instance is 3, but since our selected I is the index, which would go from 0 to 2, we need to make sure we subtract 1 from our inventory size. If you use just the inventory size, you'll go out of bounds. And again, this is because the index goes from 0 to inventory size minus 1, and not from 1 to inventory size. And now that we've checked the bottom cap, we need to go ahead and check the top cap. So this is going to be else if selected I is greater than or equal to the inventory size. And if that's the case, then we want to loop our player from the end of the inventory back to the beginning of the inventory. So we're going to do selected I equals 0. And that's all we're doing for our iterate function. So now we can go ahead and create our add item function. So again, void uMyInventory, add item. And the arguments for this were an f string of name and an integer of amount. And what we're going to be doing inside this function is first checking if an item already matches the current name we're trying to add and adding the new amount to that item, and checking for an empty slot, so if we end up not having the item already in our inventory, we can add it to the first empty slot, and we'll also be making sure that our inventory is not full. So the first thing I'm going to do inside here is actually create 2 variables. The first one is going to be an int, and I'm going to call it first empty. And we're going to set it to -1. And the reason we're setting it to -1 is so that way we're able to determine at the end if there was an empty slot or not. We know that if it's still -1, that means it couldn't find an empty and that our inventory is full. The next variable is going to be a boolean, and this is going to be called has, and we're going to default it to false. The reason we want it to start as false is because we're going to assume that we don't already have this item that we're adding to our inventory. From here, we can go ahead and create a for loop, so that way we can check if the item already exists in our inventory. So we're going to do int I equals 0 as long as I is less than inventory size, then I++. Make sure to do inventory size. And again, we're wanting to check if the item already exists in our inventory, so we're going to be doing item names of our current index of I is equal to the name that we sent in through the function. In other words, the item we're trying to currently pick up. And if that is the case, in other words, we do have a slot in our inventory that already has this item in it, then we want to go ahead and take our inventory amounts and plus equals the amount that was passed in the function at the top. Sorry, you want to do item amounts I, so that way you get the correct index, plus equals amounts. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and say that we do have this. So our has boolean does equal true. And then I'm also going to break. And the reason we're using a break is because we no longer need to continue iterating through our inventory to determine if the item exists, because we already know it does. So it saves us some time by just breaking out and not checking things that we no longer need to check. Now we need to handle for if the name doesn't match. In other words, we don't already have this item inside our inventory. So we're going to add a else if. And inside this else if, we want to be checking if the item name at the current index equals empty. And if it does, then we also want to check that first empty does not currently equal -1. And the reason we're checking for the first empty to not equal -1 is so that we don't continuously assign the current index to this first empty after we've already found the first empty. So for instance, if you had a first empty at both index 0 and index 1, if you don't have the check to see if it's not equal to -1, then whenever it iterates through the first time, it'll set first empty to 0, which will be your actual first empty. But then if it iterates through again, it'll then set your first empty to 1 because the name of that space is still empty. So that's why we have that second check there to make sure that we haven't already assigned the first empty spot. But after we've checked that both of those instances are true, we can go ahead and set our first empty to our current I value. And the reason we're checking for our empty and the same for loop that we're checking to see if we already have the item is so that way if we don't end up having the item, we don't have to iterate through a for loop again to see where the first empty spot is. And that's all we're going to be doing for this for loop. So now we need to do the handling for if the item wasn't already in the inventory. And the way we're going to start that is by checking that has is false. And if has is false, then we want to check that our first empty does not equal -1. And the reason we're doing this is because if first empty still equals -1 after going through the for loop above, it means that our inventory is full and there's no empty spots for us to add this item. So after we've determined that first empty in fact had a spot, then we can go ahead and take our item names at the index of first empty and make it equal to the name that we took in as an argument, and we can do the same with item amounts. And make it equal to the amount that we took in as an argument. And again, this if statement is making sure that an empty spot exists, and if it did, it's overriding that empty with the new values of the name and amount that we're currently picking up. And then we'll go ahead and do handling for if it's full, and for now I'm just going to do a g-engine, add on screen debug, and we're going to use this to inform us for now that our inventory is full. Later on, when we have UI, we'll display that on the screen to the player, but for now we're just going to have it as a debug message. And that's everything that we're going to be doing for this video. I'm going to go ahead and go to the scene and compile just to make sure that there were no errors that I missed. But we won't actually be testing the code in this video because we're still not quite done with it. We'll be finishing it in the next video and testing it then. But as a recap for this video, we created a function that initializes our inventory as empty, a function that allows us to iterate through our inventory and do handling for when our player has reached the caps of our inventory, as well as creating an add function that handles if the item already exists in our inventory, if it doesn't exist, and if there are currently empty slots. In the next video, we'll be doing user inputs so that we can actually iterate through our inventory as well as picking up items. As always, I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments, or you can join our Discord and ask them there. We do videos here every Wednesday through Saturday, but we also stream on Twitch Monday through Wednesday, so if that interests you, be sure to check that out. We've also created an app on the Google Play Store called Blastoff, and we've created an asset pack of kids' toys on the Unity store. If any of those things interest you, or you would like to support us in any of those ways, all of the links for those things will be in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.